My talk today is going to focus on subgroup analyses and specifically interpretation of subgroup analyses. Just a slight disclaimer before I begin, I've had a terrible cough recently and I'm pretty much over it, but if I do need to have a few little water breaks and coughing breaks, I apologise in advance. So just to give an overview of today's session, to begin with, I'll briefly recap what a subgroup analysis is and why you might want to do one. I'll provide a summary of some existing research which has shown that Cochrane Review authors don't sufficiently report their interpretation of subgroup analyses. And as that research suggested that authors don't sufficiently report their interpretation, myself and colleagues at Cochrane Infectious Diseases developed a tutorial with the aim of improving the interpretation of subgroup analyses in reviews. And I'll be delivering the key concepts from this tutorial throughout this short presentation. If you do want to look at the tutorial in full, it's published in Clinical Epidemiology and Global Health, and I'll include a reference to it at the end. So a subgroup analysis is performed to investigate how treatment effect varies across different subgroups of patients or trials. So when we perform a subgroup analysis, all data included in the meta-analysis is split into subgroups according to a patient characteristic such as gender, or an intervention characteristic such as dose, or a trial characteristic such as geographical location. A meta-analysis is then performed on one or more of these subgroups of trials or patients. I say one or more because you wouldn't perform a meta-analysis if only one study was included in a particular subgroup. So this is an example of a theoretical subgroup analysis, which has been performed by patient characteristic, which in this case is gender. For this particular example, data are available from each study for males and females separately, so the same trials are included in both subgroups. So we have study A to D in both subgroups. If we had different trials included in each subgroup, so perhaps some trials only included males and some trials only included females, the findings of the subgroup analysis would be less reliable. You can still perform the analysis in that way, but generally it's better to be looking at within study relationships rather than between study relationships between a subgroup characteristic and outcome. So looking at this forest plot, you can see at the bottom we have the test for subgroup differences. This should always be provided for a subgroup analysis. We also have the overall pooled result. Now, this doesn't have to be provided. Generally, authors should decide whether to provide the pooled results based on a decision about whether it's clinically meaningful to do so. So, for example, if the treatment effect for one subgroup favoured one intervention strongly and the treatment effect for the other subgroup favoured the other intervention strongly, it wouldn't mean much to provide a pooled estimate across those two subgroups, showing probably no effect. Okay, so this here is an example of a subgroup analysis performed by trial characteristic, which in this case is geographic location. So you can see that different trials have been included in each subgroup, which will always be the case when you're performing a subgroup analysis according to a trial characteristic. I'll just mention here that the theoretical examples in the rest of the session are subgroup analysis by trial characteristics, but the same principles of interpretation apply to subgroup analyses, whether it's by trial or by participant or by intervention characteristic. So before I talk about how to interpret a subgroup analysis, it's important to know that the reason for performing the subgroup analysis is key when it comes to interpretation. So there are two reasons why you might perform a subgroup analysis. And the first is to investigate sources of heterogeneity or differences between treatment effects from individual trials in the meta-analysis. So if you have a group of trials that suggest very different treatment effects, it might be inappropriate to draw conclusions from a meta-analysis based on a pooled result of all of those trials. However, if you conduct subgroup analysis and the subgroup analysis manages to explain all of the heterogeneity, then you'll be able to draw valid conclusions using the treatment effects for each subgroup. The second reason that you might want to conduct a subgroup analysis is to answer specific questions about particular patient groups, types of intervention or types of study. You do this even when there isn't any heterogeneity present, and authors might decide to do this if they have reason to believe that treatment effect varies among different subgroups of patients or trials, and they might believe that due to results from previous studies, and they might think that it's important to summarise treatment effect in those groups, regardless of whether heterogeneity is there or not. And another key point that I did just want to raise here is the importance of pre-specifying and providing justification for each characteristic that will be investigated in subgroup analyses. So I've just included a little screenshot from the MESA standards for the reporting of protocols of new Cochrane intervention reviews to show that this is listed in there as a key thing that you need to do. If you pre-specify and justify your subgroup analysis at protocol stage, this gives extra credibility to your interpretation of the findings. So readers can be confident that you haven't performed lots and lots of subgroup analyses and only reported the ones with interesting findings. If you did overlook a characteristic at protocol stage and did want to investigate that as subgroup analyses when you conduct the review, you still could do it, but I'd advise highlighting that it's a post hoc analysis when you do the interpretation. So moving on to existing methodological research in this area, my colleague Sarah Donegan lists 5 criteria that are essential to meet when interpreting subgroup analyses. And the 5 criteria are whether a statistically significant subgroup difference or interaction, as it can also be known, was detected. To consider the covariate distribution, which is the number of trials and participants contributing to each subgroup. She lists the plausibility of the interaction or lack of interaction as something that's essential to report, the importance of the interaction or lack of interaction, and also the possibility of confounding should be considered as well. And I will go through each of those in turn to provide some clarity on their meaning. So Sarah Donegan did a review of 52 Cochrane reviews and found that 62% of reviews did do subgroup analyses, but none interpreted them with respect to all 5 criteria. So to expand on that work, myself and Sarah hypothesised that perhaps Cochrane review authors don't know how to interpret subgroup analyses, and we conducted a small survey to find out if this was the case. So we invited the review authors from Sarah's previous review to interpret 5 subgroup analyses on an online survey site. The subgroup analyses had no clinical context, so it was only possible to assess whether authors knew how to interpret subgroup analyses with respect to the first 2 criteria, so whether there's a statistically significant subgroup effect and whether they considered the covariate distribution, so the number of trials and patients contributing to each subgroup. We weren't able to investigate whether they knew how to assess the plausibility, the importance of the subgroup effect, and also the possibility of confounding. So when we asked authors to interpret these subgroup analyses, 47% of review authors didn't consider the covariate distribution for any of the presented subgroup analyses. And when asked if there was a statistically significant subgroup effect, 17% of review authors answered that they didn't know for at least one subgroup analysis, and 28% of review authors answered incorrectly. So based on that work, we thought it was quite important to develop a tutorial to try and improve Cochrane review authors' knowledge of subgroup interpretation. So I'll now go through each criteria in turn, giving a little bit more information before we look at some example subgroup analyses. So to address the first criteria, you need to report whether a statistically significant subgroup effect was detected. To do this, we look at the p-value from the test for subgroup differences. We usually use a p-value of less than 0.1 to indicate a statistically significant subgroup effect. And we use 0.1 instead of 0.05 due to the fact that the test is quite low powered. It's also useful to report whether the subgroup effect is quantitative or qualitative. So if the effect is quantitative, that means that the treatment effects for different subgroups favour the same treatment but vary in terms of the size of the effect. If the effect is qualitative, then the treatment effects for different subgroups favour different treatments. It is also useful to report the extent of remaining heterogeneity after the subgroup analysis has been done. If the heterogeneity has been explained completely and there's no heterogeneity remaining in each subgroup, then that's great. The subgroup analysis has explained what's causing the heterogeneity, and you can draw valid conclusions for each subgroup. If there is still considerable heterogeneity within a subgroup, then the next slide gives some suggestions on what you might want to do. So if you have considerable heterogeneity within a subgroup or multiple subgroups, we need to consider whether it's appropriate and informative to present the analysis. And the answer to this question is likely to depend on the original reason for conducting the analysis. So this is why I mentioned why you might have performed subgroup analyses earlier on in the session. So the first reason you might have done a subgroup analysis is to investigate sources of heterogeneity. And if that's the case, I'd advise examining the forest plot, assessing whether heterogeneity is lower within subgroups than across trials. And if the heterogeneity isn't lower within the subgroups than across the trials, than across all the trials, then it might not be useful to present the analysis, as the subgroup analysis hasn't actually explained heterogeneity at all. If the subgroup analysis was performed to provide estimates of treatment effects for clinically relevant subgroups of patients, review authors may decide that heterogeneity within each subgroup renders the results for each subgroup to be meaningless and to not present the subgroup analysis. Or they may decide that it is important to show whether or not statistically significant subgroup differences exist for the covariate of interest and present the analysis. If the authors were going to present the analysis, then I'd usually recommend acknowledging the uncertainty in the evidence due to that residual heterogeneity. And I'll just mention here as well that if you do decide to not present an analysis, in the interests of making everything transparent, you can say that you did the analysis, but just haven't presented it, and provide the reasons for not presenting it in the text of your review. So the second criteria is considering the number of trials and participants contributing to each subgroup. And the Cochrane Handbook states that it's unlikely that an investigation of heterogeneity will produce useful findings unless there is a substantial number of studies, and that at least 10 studies in a meta-analysis should be available for each characteristic modelled, but that may be too few still if the covariates are unevenly distributed. And what that means is if there is a limited amount of data for a particular subgroup. So you say you have lots and lots of trials for one subgroup, but only a couple for another subgroup, then that 10 studies may still not be enough. Criteria 3 is to consider the plausibility of the interaction or lack of interaction. So existing research, such as animal studies or studies of similar interventions, may provide information on plausibility. Existing evidence may substantiate the findings. So, for example, if there's biological grounds for a subgroup effect, or if the existing evidence suggests that a subgroup effect is not plausible, then that may raise the possibility that the reported subgroup effect is spurious. Criteria 4 is considering the importance of the interaction or lack of interaction. And here it's important to consider whether differences between effect estimates would impact clinical decisions, and it may be useful to consult with clinical experts here if you're unsure about the importance of an identified subgroup effect. Okay, so 5 is considering the possibility of confounding, and to demonstrate confounding, let's consider a meta-analysis that includes trials comparing treatment A and treatment B. So let's assume that treatment A varies in intensiveness. So some trials compare intensive treatment A to treatment B, and other trials compare non-intensive treatment A to treatment B. And now we assume that we're doing a subgroup analysis, which was performed to investigate whether the intensiveness of treatment A modifies the treatment effect of treatment A versus treatment B. So here, if you're considering confounding, the review authors should think about whether there might be some other factor that's causing a subgroup difference to be identified. So, for example, it may be that trials of the more intensive version of treatment A also recruited patients with more severe disease. And it may be that severity of disease is the true effect modifier, as it affects both the is related to both the intensiveness and the treatment effect. Now, if that is true, it would be misleading to conclude that intensiveness of treatment A modifies the treatment effect, as this relationship is confounded. And we don't really know if there is effect modification by intensiveness of treatment, as confounding factors are at play. Okay, so we have some theoretical examples now. So similar to the survey, these theoretical examples can only really demonstrate how to interpret results of subgroup analyses with regards to criteria 1 and 2. We'll look at the end of the session at a real life subgroup analysis to demonstrate how to apply criteria 3, 4, and 5. So in all of these theoretical examples, we're going to be looking at the impact of geographic location on treatment effect. So to begin with, when we're interpreting the subgroup analysis, we can see that the test for subgroup differences indicates a statistically significant subgroup effect. We can see that both treatment effects for both subgroups favour the same intervention, so the effect is quantitative. We can see that there's no residual heterogeneity left within each subgroup. And we can see that 5 studies contribute to each subgroup, and almost 1,000 patients in each, almost 2,000 patients in each subgroup as well. So we do have a good amount of data contributing to each subgroup here. So the next slide, there's a lot of text on this, sorry, but so in the paper of this tutorial, we give some examples of what you might write in your text. I've just took a few bits out of it. So we could say that geographical location statistically significantly modifies the effect of intervention A in comparison to intervention B, and quote the p-value. We could say that the treatment effect favours intervention A over intervention B for both trials conducted in Asia and trials conducted in Africa, but the treatment effect is greater for trials conducted in Asia than for trials conducted in Africa, so the subgroup effect is quantitative. We could say there's no heterogeneity between results from the trials within each subgroup that requires further exploration. And we can also say that a sufficient number of trials and participants were included in each subgroup, so the covariate distribution is not concerning for this subgroup analysis. So I won't put this up for each example because it does get a little bit repetitive, but as I said, the full details are in the tutorial online if anyone wants to have a look. So our second example, again, we have a statistically significant subgroup effect. This time we have a qualitative subgroup effect, as the treatment effects for different subgroups favour different treatments. Here we have substantial heterogeneity in each subgroup remaining. And again, we have 5 studies contributing to each subgroup and quite a large number of patients. So the covariate distribution doesn't seem to be particularly concerning. So the main thing to focus on here is that substantial heterogeneity that's left over within each subgroup. So thinking about the slide we had earlier about what to do if there's residual heterogeneity, we need to think about here if it's appropriate and informative to present this analysis. Now, without knowing the clinical context here, it is difficult to say. It might be that although the So if the reason for conducting the subgroup analysis was to investigate heterogeneity, you probably wouldn't present this analysis, as the heterogeneity hasn't really been explained at all. If the reason for conducting the analysis was to summarise treatment effects for clinically relevant subgroups of patients, it might be decided that you still do want to show that there's a statistically significant subgroup effect, and to show the treatment effects for those subgroups. However, if you did want to do that, I did just include some text that could be used as a caveat. So you could say something like, there's substantial unexplained heterogeneity between the trials within each of these subgroups, and therefore the validity of the treatment effect estimate for each subgroup is uncertain, as individual trial results are inconsistent. So that's if you did present it, but you could decide to not present it. So our third example, this time we have a non-significant p-value. We have moderate heterogeneity in the Asia subgroup there, but none in the Africa subgroup. We have 4 studies contributing to the Asia subgroup and 6 to the Africa subgroup. So we have more patients contributing to the Africa subgroup than the Asia subgroup as well. So in real life, we would probably need clinical input to determine whether the uneven covariate distribution is an important issue here. It may be that if we had more trials in the Asia subgroup, then a statistically significant subgroup effect would be observed. And thinking about that residual heterogeneity in the Asia subgroup, it's probably unlikely that this analysis was performed to investigate sources of heterogeneity. As you can see from the I-squared for the overall result, which is 22%, there wasn't much heterogeneity to begin with. So it's more likely that this analysis has been performed to provide estimates of treatment effect for clinically relevant subgroups of patients. So review authors would need to decide whether it's important to present treatment effect estimates for these subgroups. So the review authors may decide that residual heterogeneity for that Asia subgroup renders the results to be meaningless, or they may decide that the covariate distribution is concerning. They may also decide that it's not important to present, as the subgroup analysis didn't identify any significant subgroup effects. So all of those are reasons that they might decide not to present the analysis. However, they may also decide to present the analysis to present estimates of treatment effects for those subgroups. And if they were going to do that, again, we'd recommend acknowledging the uncertainty in the evidence when interpreting results for a heterogeneous subgroup, and also to mention the covariate distribution. So we have some text here that just mentions the fact that a smaller number of trials and participants contributed data to the Asia subgroup than to the Africa subgroup, and also mentioning that unexplained heterogeneity as well. So the final theoretical example, we'll look at the p-value first, which suggests a statistically significant and quantitative subgroup effect, as the treatment effects favour intervention A for both subgroups. We have no residual heterogeneity left over. However, the major thing to focus on here is that we have far more evidence for the Asia subgroup than the Africa subgroup. We have over 2,000 patients contributing data to the Asia subgroup and less than 200 contributing to the Africa subgroup. So I would say here that it's highly unlikely that this subgroup analysis can be relied on to produce valid results. And if review authors did decide not to present this analysis, which is what I would almost certainly recommend, but clinical context could provide further justification for that decision, I would include something in the text that says that we did the analysis and explain why it hasn't been presented, which is due to the fact that a far smaller number of trials and participants contributed data to the Africa subgroup than to the Asia subgroup, meaning that the analysis is unlikely to produce useful findings. Okay, so moving on to a real-life subgroup analysis with clinical context. We've previously discussed how to interpret subgroup analysis with regards to criteria 1 and 2, using hypothetical scenarios. We'll now look at an example of a subgroup analysis from a published Cochrane review to demonstrate how to apply this knowledge of subgroup analyses in practice. And this will allow us to consider how to adhere to criteria 3, 4, and 5. So this example has been taken from the Cochrane review, artemisinin-based combination therapy for treating uncomplicated malaria, which was published by Dave Sinclair et al. The subgroup analysis compares the effect of 2 malaria treatments, artemethyl lumefantrine, or AL6, and amidiaquine plus sulfadoxine pyrimethamine, or AQ plus SP, on the outcome of total treatment failure at day 28. And the characteristic being investigated here is geographical region. So looking at the p-value, we have a highly statistically significant subgroup effect, suggesting that geographic region significantly modifies the effect of AL6 in comparison to AQ plus SP. We can see that the subgroup effect is qualitative, as AL6 is favoured for East African populations and AQ plus SP is favoured for West Africa populations. There's a small amount of heterogeneity between results from the trials within the West Africa subgroup. You can see that we have a very, very small trial which is suggesting a treatment effect in favour of AL6, but there's so few participants included in that study that the confidence intervals are very wide. So that's the reason for the heterogeneity there. However, visually examining the heterogeneity on this forest plot, you can see that the subgroup analysis has explained heterogeneity, and there's less heterogeneity within subgroups than across all trials in the analysis. And thinking about the covariate distribution, we have a small number of trials contributing to each subgroup, and this means that we probably don't have enough evidence to confidently conclude that there is a true subgroup effect. Now, because there is a small number of trials contributing to each subgroup, it's particularly useful to think about the plausibility of the subgroup effect here. So we know from existing research that levels of resistance to the antimalarial drugs used in these studies do differ between East and West Africa. So the plausibility of a subgroup effect here is high. And this adds credibility to the results of the subgroup analysis. Moving on to importance, this analysis suggests that one treatment is efficient for East African populations and a different treatment is effective for West African populations. So this could certainly impact policy decisions, and therefore the importance of the subgroup analysis is high. Finally, we consider the possibility of confounding factors. The authors of this Cochrane review listed key characteristics of the trials included in this subgroup analysis, and they didn't identify any potential confounding factors that could cause differences in treatment effect between the East African and West African trials, and therefore confounding wasn't thought to be an issue of concern here. So what I would take away from this real-life example is that, of course, there's not a great amount of data here. However, we do have a statistically significant subgroup effect, which is plausible and important. But due to the limited number of trials, it would be useful if further studies were conducted in these areas to confirm the subgroup effect. So the key messages that I'd like you all to take home from this session today is that the interpretation of subgroup analysis depends on the initial motivation for conducting the analysis. It's not always essential to report subgroup of analyses that have been conducted in full. You can always note that they have been done, but explain your reasons for not presenting them. It's essential to get clinical input, so statisticians such as myself can only help you so far. Clinical input will always be required, but generally careful interpretation of subgroup analyses in reviews can make huge differences, as it can affect health policy decisions, and therefore we all need to be making the most of these valuable analyses. And just before I finish, I just wanted to mention that Stefan, a researcher from Basel University, got in touch with me a couple of days ago when he saw that I was doing this talk and told me about his instrument that he has developed with his colleagues to assess the credibility of subgroup analyses in randomized controlled trials and meta-analyses. And I was hoping that he was going to be able to be here to tell us about this in the discussion part of this webinar. However, he let me know this morning that he's not able to make it anymore, and I'm not very familiar with the tool myself, as I've only just found out about it. So if you would like to have a look at that, please go out and seek it for yourselves. The reference is here alongside the reference for Sarah Donegan's initial paper reporting a lack of interpretation in Cochrane reviews, the paper of the Cochrane Review from which I took the real life subgroup analysis, and also the full reference for the tutorial, which this session has largely been based on. So I will finish there and would welcome any questions and discussion points.